Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
It is good to be back. And today we're doing something a little different. It's a difficult, but I think a really necessary excavation. We are going to be looking at the machinery of state power.
And this isn't just some abstract political science class. We're diving into a book that was written in the the smoking aftermath of one of the most divisive periods in modern American history.
That's right. The book is For Reasons of State by Noam Chomsky, published in 1973.
So let's set the scene, because you really can't understand the book without understanding the moment. 1973.
Right. So you have to picture it. The Vietnam War is technically still happening, but it's in its final chaotic stages. And more importantly, the Pentagon Papers have just dropped.
Like a bomb.
Absolutely. This huge, massive trove of secret government documents gets leaked, and it just rips the veil off decades of decision-making. The public is seeing for the first time what was being said behind closed doors.
And it creates this wave of disillusionment. I think for a lot of people, the first reaction to all this, the war, the papers, was to look for a villain. You know, who's the bad guy?
Sure. Was it Kennedy? Was it Johnson? Nixon? Was it specific general in the field? People wanted to pin the blame on a person.
But the thing I found so compelling and honestly a little unsettling about this deep dive into Chomsky's work is that he just isn't interested in that. He's not trying to find the one bad apple.
Exactly. And that's really the mission here for us today. And it was the mission of the book itself. This is a systems-level analysis. If you're coming into this looking for a simple story about a few bad men, you're going to be disappointed.
So what's the argument then? If it's not bad people, what is it?
Chomsky's argument is that the violence, the interventions, the sheer scale of destruction we saw in Southeast Asia, these were not accidents. They weren't quagmires that we just stumbled into.
Right, the Greek tragedy defense. That we wandered into a mess with the best of intentions.
Precisely. And he rejects that completely. His core thesis is that these outcomes are predictable. They are, in fact, the rational outputs of a centralized system.
Rational? How can destroying entire countries be rational?
Because the system isn't designed to protect human life. It's designed to protect and expand its own power, which primarily means protecting global economic dominance. The state operates for reasons of state, and those reasons almost always trace back to power and money.
Okay, so if the output is carnage, but the input logic is, as you say, rational, then we have to look at the people and the process in the middle.
Yes. And this brings us to one of the most chilling concepts from the book. He calls them the backroom boys.
The backroom boys. It sounds almost quaint.
It does, doesn't it? Like some guys playing cards. But it refers to the planners, the technocrats, the architects of policy in Washington.
Let's really unpack this, because the contrast here is just staggering. When anyone thinks of the Vietnam War, you think of the jungle, the heat, the noise, the sheer visceral horror of combat.
Of course. But the decisions that create that horror, they take place in a completely different universe.
In quiet, air-conditioned offices.
That's exactly. In Washington. Chomsky draws this visual directly from reading the Pentagon Papers. He talks about their cool and antiseptic quality. You're reading these memos, and they are perfectly typed. They have nicely defined margins.
The language is calm.
Urbane, authoritative. These are highly educated men discussing things like kill ratios, pacification programs, and forced urbanization with the same emotional tone you or I might use to discuss, shipping logistics for a furniture company.
There's a total disconnect between the paperwork and the reality on the ground.
A profound one. On one side, you have the neat antiseptic memorandum. On the other side, you have what Chomsky starkly calls decomposing bodies in a ditch.
And the goal for us today is to understand the logic that connects those two things, the planning logic that makes that disconnect possible. How does a person sit in an office and sign off on policies that lead to burning villages without seeing themselves as a monster?
And this is the scariest part. The answer isn't that they are monsters, not in the way we think of them, like some mustache-twirling villain. They're described as affable, authoritative, urbane men.
They're the guy next door. They're the decorated academic from a top university.
Yes, they're seen as the best and the brightest. But the system they operate within, it rewards a very specific kind of thinking. It rewards efficiency, and it filters out morality.
There's a story in the book, an anecdote, that just perfectly captures this mindset. It's about napalm.
It's a devastating story, but you have to hear it to understand the point. It's about a pilot, an American pilot, talking about the backroom boys at Dow Chemical. That's the company that manufactured the napalm.
And he's not complaining about them, he's praising them.
Yes. The quote is, "We sure are pleased with those backroom boys at Dow." He's happy with their work.
And his reasoning is, well, it's horrifying. He explains that the original napalm, the first version, it wasn't hot enough. It had a design flaw.
A design flaw. From the perspective of the user, the pilot, the flaw was that if the Vietnamese peasants were quick, they could actually scrape it off their skin. It didn't adhere well enough.
So that's the problem presented to the chemists at Dow. The product is inefficient.
It's just a technical problem to be solved. So what's the innovation? They add polystyrene, and the pilot explains, and this is a direct quote from the source material, "Now it sticks like shit to a blanket."
Problem solved. But they didn't stop there.
No. There was another flaw. If the victims managed to jump into water like a river or a paddy, the flames would go out. The burning would stop.
Another inefficiency.
So the boys at Dow come up with another technical solution. They add white phosphorus to the mix. Willie Peter, as the soldiers called it.
Why white phosphorus?
Because it burns underwater. It'll keep burning right down to the bone. And then the pilot adds this final chilling detail. He says, essentially, so they die anyway from phosphorus poisoning. Now, you have to analyze that from a systems perspective. The chemists at Dow were given a series of technical problems. The product doesn't stick. Solution: add polystyrene. The product is extinguished by water. Solution: add white phosphorus.
They're just solving the engineering puzzle.
Precisely. The system rewards them for the increased efficiency of the burning, the morality of the outcome, the unimaginable agony of a human being burning to death underwater. That's an externality. It's not part of the equation. It doesn't compute in the system.
It's the bureaucratization of homicide. And this cold, antiseptic logic, it doesn't just apply to the weapons. It applies to the language the state uses to justify everything.
This is a massive theme for reasons of state. The deliberate sanitization of violence through language. The state creates what Chomsky calls a legitimacy language.
Give me some examples.
Okay, you don't destroy a village, you pacify it. You don't invade a country, you conduct a protective reaction strike. You don't force millions of peasants off their ancestral land and into slums. You engage in urbanization and modernization.
It's all designed to sound reasonable, responsible even.
It's designed to be boring, to be bureaucratic, to remove any sense of human consequence. There's that example from the book about the bombing of Haiphong Harbor.
Oh, right.
The official spokesman for the U.S. government stood up in front of the press and stated with complete confidence that only military targets were being hit. They listed them off. Logistical points, cement factories, marshalling yards, all very precise, very clean.
But what was actually happening on the ground?
Eyewitnesses, including Western journalists who were there, reported something completely different. Entire residential neighborhoods flattened, schools destroyed, hospitals hit repeatedly. One reporter described the western zone of the city as simply a wasteland.
So were the spokesmen just lying?
It's more complicated than that. This is where the system of denial kicks in. It's not just about deceiving the public. It's about the system refusing to perceive facts that contradict its own narrative.
How does that work?
If the official policy says we only hit military targets, then the rubble of a hospital cannot officially exist in the system's worldview. It must be an anomaly, a tragic mistake. Or, and this was a very common tactic, it's dismissed as enemy propaganda.
The communists bombed their own hospital to make us look bad.
Exactly. The system's narrative integrity is more important than the ground truth. There was a specific massacre mentioned that really highlights this. We've all heard of My Lai.
Sure.
But the source discusses another one, My Quarry. A similar event, scores of civilians killed by American soldiers. But when it was investigated, the legal proceedings against the officer in charge were just dismissed.
Why?
Because the system officially determined that there had been no massacre. It was redefined. It was classified as a normal operation of forced relocation that met with some resistance.
So the village was destroyed, the people were dead, but because it followed a certain bureaucratic script for pacification, it wasn't a crime, it was just procedure.
You've got it. That's a terrifying thought, isn't it? It implies that the crime of My Lai, in the eyes of the system, wasn't the killing of civilians. The crime was that the soldiers went off script. They lost their cool, their discipline. It was messy.
Whereas if you kill civilians while following the cool, antiseptic, pre-approved script, it's just policy.
It's just policy. And that is the perfect bridge to the Pentagon Papers. Because I think the common wisdom about the papers, the movie version, is that they proved the government was lying to the American people.
Right. That's the standard take. They knew all along we couldn't win, and they sent boys to die anyway, and they lied about it.
Which is true, on a surface level.
Mm.
But Chomsky argues that lying is not quite the right word. He says it's too simple.
That's too simple about it. It seems pretty straightforward.
Because lying implies that the planners knew the real truth, and they consciously decided to tell the public the opposite. Chomsky's analysis suggests that deception is much deeper, much more insidious. The planners, he argues, often believe their own propaganda.
They internalize the myths?
They have to. To function in that system, to make the kinds of decisions they were making day after day, you have to genuinely believe in the fundamental goodness of the mission. You have to drink the Kool-Aid.
So let's take an example, the aggression narrative.
A perfect example. The entire U.S. intervention was justified on the grounds that we were defending a sovereign South Vietnam from aggression by North Vietnam.
Which is already a strange framing if you just look at a map. It's one country, Vietnam, that was temporarily divided after French colonialism.
Precisely. The U.S. was the foreign power that had inserted itself with thousands of troops into a civil war. But if you read the internal memos, the planners talk constantly about North Vietnamese aggression. They had to frame it that way.
They saw the North Vietnamese as foreign invaders in their own country.
And therefore, the Americans were the defenders. It's a complete inversion of reality, but it was essential for the system's internal logic.
But what about the intelligence agencies? Surely the CIA knew what was really happening.
You would think so. But the system has a way of distorting intelligence, too. For years, the intel agencies were under immense pressure to prove that the insurgency in the South, the Viet Cong, was being directly controlled and supplied by Hanoi.
They needed that link.
They absolutely needed it, because if it's just a popular indigenous rebellion against a corrupt U.S.-backed government in Saigon, then the U.S. has no legal or moral justification for being there. It has to be external aggression to fit the narrative.
But the evidence wasn't there.
For a very long time, it simply wasn't. The intelligence reports kept coming back saying the insurgency was largely homegrown, Southern. But the planners in Washington didn't want to hear that. They needed the link to exist, so they acted as if it were true, disregarding the lack of evidence.
This is what Chomsky calls the logical gap.
That's the term he uses. The system needed to bridge the gap between the reality Hanoi offers some support to a Southern rebellion and the necessary myth. Hanoi is the agent of a global communist conspiracy puppeteered by Moscow and Beijing to conquer Southeast Asia.
And that's where the whole Cold War framework becomes so important.
Yes, and this is a really crucial insight for anyone listening. We tend to think of the Cold War as this period where we, the public, needed protection from the scary Soviet Union. Chomsky completely flips that on its head.
How so?
He analyzes the Cold War not as a genuine conflict for safety, but as a mechanism for population management.
Population management, you mean controlling us, the American public?
Oh, absolutely. The concept of a monolithic external enemy, whether it's the Soviets or Red China, is incredibly useful for a state. If you can keep your population in a state of fear, you can mobilize support for things they would otherwise reject.
Like what?
Like enormous military budgets that divert resources from social programs.
Yeah.
Like intervening in tiny, impoverished countries on the other side of the world that pose zero actual threat to the United States. You can frame every single local conflict as a zero-sum game.
The idea that if we don't control this specific rice paddy in Vietnam, then the Soviets automatically will.
Correct. A loss for us is a win for them. And you look at the internal records in the Pentagon Papers, the planners often knew that the Soviets or Chinese weren't actually pulling the strings in Vietnam. They knew it was a nationalist movement. But they needed the myth of the monolithic enemy to sell the war at home.
Okay, so let's pause and take stock here. If the aggression narrative is an internalized lie, and the Cold War is a tool for managing the public, what is the real reason? Why were they so obsessed with Vietnam?
This is where we get to the core of the system's logic. It moves away from the military justification and into the economic one. This brings us to the grand area strategy and the real meaning of the domino theory.
We've all heard the domino theory.
We've heard the cartoon version, the version that was sold to the public. If Vietnam falls to communism, then Laos falls, then Cambodia, then Thailand.
And pretty soon, the communists are surfing in California.
Right. That's the scary story for public consumption. But the real domino theory, the one the planners discussed among themselves in these secret documents, was much more sophisticated and, from their perspective, much more rational.
It wasn't about a military invasion.
Not at all. It was about something they called the demonstration effect.
The demonstration effect. That sounds like a business term.
And in a way, it is. The real fear wasn't that the Vietnamese army would conquer Asia. The fear was that if a small, poor country like Vietnam could successfully develop independently, if it could pull itself out of poverty outside of the U.S.-dominated global economic system, it would be a dangerous example.
It would demonstrate to other countries that they could do the same.
You got it. It would be a virus, as they sometimes called it. It could spread what they termed the rot.
And the rot isn't communism per se. The rot is the idea of successful, independent nationalism.
That's the threat. If Vietnam succeeds on its own terms, then maybe the Philippines tries it. Maybe Indonesia, with all its resources, decides to go its own way. Maybe the countries of Latin America get ideas. And if all these countries start developing for the benefit of their own people, instead of serving the needs of Western corporations,
then the U.S. and its allies lose access.
They lose access to markets, to cheap labor, and to raw materials. And this brings us to the Japan connection, which is absolutely critical to Chomsky's analysis, but is almost never taught in high school history.
I have to admit, I was surprised to see how much of the book's analysis of Vietnam focused on Japan.
You have to look at the global chessboard, as the planner saw it. After World War II, the U.S. rebuilt Japan to be its primary industrial partner in Asia, its junior partner in the global system.
The anchor of the Pacific.
Exactly. But Japan is an industrial powerhouse, with almost no natural resources of its own. It needs oil, rubber, tin, rice, lumber. And historically, where did Japan get those things?
From Southeast Asia. From China.
Right. The U.S. planners in the late 40s and 50s were terrified that if all of Southeast Asia became independent or communist, which for them was just a label for any country that opted out of the U.S. system, then Japan would be cut off from its essential markets and resources.
And if Japan gets cut off,
then what does Japan do to survive? It might be forced to accommodate itself to the Soviet Union or to communist China. It might drift out of the Western orbit and become an economic competitor.
So the primary goal was to keep Southeast Asia open for Japan.
The primary system goal, as Chomsky lays it out, was to keep Southeast Asia integrated into the U.S.-dominated global economy, specifically to ensure that Japan remained firmly and safely within the American camp.
So in a very real sense, Vietnam was being bombed and destroyed to keep Japan capitalist and aligned with the U.S.
That is the cold geopolitical equation. This is what's sometimes called the imperialism of free trade. The goal isn't to own colonies. The goal is to create an integrated global system where U.S. capital and allied capital like Japan's can operate without restrictions.
And any country that tries to remove itself from that system, that tries a do-it-yourself model of development,
is a threat. Not a military threat to California, but an ideological threat, a threat to the integrity of the whole system.
And this explains why the U.S. has so often supported brutal dictators over popular nationalists.
It explains it perfectly. From the system's perspective, a friendly dictator like Trujillo in the Dominican Republic or Suharto in Indonesia is preferable to an independent nationalist like Castro in Cuba. The dictator might be a monster, but if he keeps his country's markets open and plays by the rules of the global system, he's our guy.
Whereas the nationalist, even if he's a Democrat, is a virus that could spread the rot of independence.
Precisely. It shifts your entire perspective from defending freedom to defending a global economic architecture.
Okay, but a system this complex requires a lot of smart people to run it. You need people to write the memos, to develop the strategies, to sell it to the public.
You do. And this brings us to the role of the experts. The universities, what Chomsky famously called the new mandarins.
This is a pretty sharp critique of the intellectual class.
It's scathing. You know, we have this idea of universities as these pure ivory towers of neutral, objective thought. Chomsky argues that, in practice, they are nothing of the sort.
They're service institutions for power.
To a large extent, yes. He argues that the liberal technical intelligentsia, the professors of political science, the economists, the researchers at think tanks, they overwhelmingly serve the institutions that provide them with funding, with access, and with status.
And in the Cold War era, that meant the government and major corporations?
That's where the money and the prestige were. You get a government grant, you consult for the Rand Corporation, you take a leave of absence to go work at the State Department, you become part of the machine.
There's that quote from Robert McNamara, who was Secretary of Defense under Kennedy and Johnson. He's really the archetype of this new managerial class.
He is. He came from Ford Motor Company, the ultimate technocrat, and he had this view that, as he put it, decision-making must remain at the top. He saw management as this almost divine science.
It's the mechanism for exercising reason.
Yes. For him, reason wasn't something that emerged from democratic debate. Reason was something exercised by a small group of elite, data-driven managers at the top. The masses are emotional, irrational. They can't be trusted with big decisions.
That is profoundly anti-democratic, isn't it?
It's the definition of it. It cloaks itself in the language of meritocracy and pragmatism, but at its core, it's about concentrating power in the hands of a credentialed elite.
And notice the word he uses, pragmatic. These pragmatic intellectuals, they don't waste time asking moral questions. They don't ask, is it right to bomb this country?
Oh, that's seen as a naive, emotional question. The pragmatic question is it cost effective? What's the ROI on this bombing campaign?
So the entire debate that was allowed to happen in the mainstream, in the newspapers, on television, was a debate between the optimists and the pessimists.
Exactly. The optimists were the hawks who said, we can win this war. We just need to apply more force, more technology.
And the pessimists.
They were the doves who said, this war is costing too much. It's too much blood, too much treasure. The costs are outweighing the benefits. We should find a way out.
But notice what's missing. Neither side is saying this is a criminal war of aggression.
Nobody. And that's Chomsky's core critique. By framing the debate as one of cost and feasibility, the system narrows the spectrum of acceptable thought. The fundamental legitimacy of the American intervention is taken for granted. It's assumed before the debate even begins.
It reframes a moral atrocity as a simple technical problem that's proving too difficult to solve.
A management problem. And speaking of technical problems in management, we have to talk about B.F. Skinner. The book takes this fascinating detour into behavioral science that seems, at first, like it's coming out of left field.
I remember thinking, why are we suddenly talking about a psychologist? But then it clicks.
It connects perfectly to the mindset of the planners. Skinner was the father of radical behaviorism. His core idea was that human beings are essentially complex biological machines. Our behavior is determined entirely by our environment, by a system of rewards and punishments.
So concepts we hold dear, like freedom, dignity, free will.
According to Skinner, they are pre-scientific illusions. They're just labels we put on behaviors we can't otherwise explain. He argued we are just malleable clay to be shaped by a controller of the environment.
And if you accept that premise, that's a terrifying idea to hand to the state.
It's the ultimate justification for totalitarian control. If people are just inputs and outputs, then the state is legitimized in creating a technology of behavior to engineer a more efficient, compliant society.
It legitimizes pacification.
It's a scientific rationale for it. If
Yeah.
people are just organisms reacting to stimuli, then the state is justified in applying aversive stimuli like napalm and bombing to shape their behavior towards automatic goodness.
It's social engineering on a mass scale.
That's what they were trying to do in Vietnam. Forced urbanization is a perfect example. They weren't just moving peasants off their land to get them away from Viet Cong influence. They called it modernization. They were consciously trying to destroy the traditional social fabric of the village, which they saw as backward, and remold the peasants into modern, controllable, urban consumers.
It all comes back to that cold, antiseptic view from the beginning. If a Vietnamese peasant isn't a human being with freedom and dignity, but just an organism to be conditioned, then burning them with white phosphorus isn't a moral crime.
It's just a strong stimulus, a negative reinforcement, to use the clinical language. It's horrifying, but you can see how it all fits together in one coherent, if monstrous, worldview.
Okay, so we have this massive system. It has its economic incentives, its geopolitical strategy, its intellectual cover from the universities, and even a scientific rationale from behavioral psychology. What stops it? What are the constraints on this machine?
This is one of the most important and, frankly, one of the most hopeful parts of the analysis. The constraint isn't the enemy army. It's not the Soviet Union. The primary constraint on the system is us, the American public.
The concept they called domestic constraints.
Yes. There's this absolutely stunning admission in the book from the testimony of Admiral Moore, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He's asked why the U.S. didn't just escalate the war even further.
And what does he say?
He says, essentially, that if domestic restraints were relaxed, the U.S. military could have launched amphibious assaults on North Vietnam, mined Haiphong Harbor years earlier, basically unleashed a level of violence that would have made what happened look mild.
And when he says domestic restraints, what exactly is he referring to?
He clarifies it. He's not being vague. He explicitly means the peace movement and the press.
Let that sink in. In the eyes of the highest levels of the military, the only things preventing them from total, unrestrained escalation were American citizens marching in the streets and journalists reporting the truth.
The public is effectively viewed as an impediment, an obstacle to be managed, an enemy, in some ways, of the state's true objectives. And this completely reframes the purpose of government secrecy.
Right. We're always told that documents are classified top secret to protect national security, to keep information from our enemies.
But think about it. The North Vietnamese knew they were being bombed. The peasants in Laos knew there was a secret war happening in their country. They didn't need to read a classified memo to figure that out.
So who is the secrecy for?
It was for us. The secret bombing of Cambodia is a perfect example. The Cambodians knew. The North Vietnamese knew. Who didn't know? The American public and the U.S. Congress. The secrecy was designed to keep the American taxpayer in the dark, to bypass domestic constraints, and to manufacture our consent.
So this creates a kind of feedback loop in the system.
It does. Let's try to map it out step by step. Step 1. The state, for all the economic and strategic reasons we've discussed, plans an intervention.
Step 2. They use secrecy and a defensive narrative. We're stopping aggression. We're protecting freedom to get public consent, or at least public acquiescence.
Step 3. They intervene. But then, reality hits back. The local resistance is much stronger than they anticipated. The war doesn't go as planned.
Step 4. The state's response is the technological solution. Escalate the violence. More troops, more bombs, more napalm.
Step 5, and this is the critical moment. The domestic population, students, activists, whistleblowers, honest journalists, starts to see the real cost. They see the body bags, they read the reports, they expose the immorality of it all.
And that's step 6. This domestic constraint becomes so powerful that it forces the state to limit the violence, to change its tactics, or eventually to withdraw.
So the system is in a constant battle to neutralize step 6, to bypass that feedback loop.
And how do they do that?
They try to pathologize the dissent. They commission studies that call student activists neurotic or emotional people acting out family dramas. They try to smear them as unpatriotic, or they try to co-opt the dissent.
Like Nixon running on a Peace with Honor platform.
Exactly. Promising peace in public while secretly and massively expanding the bombing campaign in private. The goal is always to neutralize the domestic constraint so the machine can continue its work unimpeded.
It's this constant push and pull between the state's desire for global dominance and the public's eventual grasp of reality.
And that brings us right up to today, to the legacy of this analysis. The big, so what? Why should we care about a book from 1973?
I think the answer is because the fundamental system hasn't really changed.
It hasn't. The structures described in the book, the power of the executive branch, the influence of corporations, the rationalizations of experts, the marginalization of the public, those are all still the pillars of modern statecraft.
And you still hear the Greek tragedy defense all the time. Oh, Vietnam was a blunder. The Iraq War was a mistake based on bad intelligence.
Chomsky warns us to be very, very skeptical of that historical rewriting. If you accept that Vietnam was a blunder, you are implicitly accepting that the intentions were good, but the execution was just flawed.
We meant well, but we messed up.
Right. Chomsky's argument is that it wasn't a blunder at all. From the perspective of the system's actual goals, it was a rational, calculated application of imperial power. And in many ways, it was a success.
A success? How can he say that? The U.S. lost the war. We withdrew in humiliation.
We withdrew. But did the system lose? Look at the region today. The virus of independent nationalism that they were so afraid of was brutally destroyed. Vietnam was so devastated it couldn't possibly serve as a model for successful do-it-yourself development.
The rot didn't spread?
The rot was contained. Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, they all remained safely within the U.S. economic orbit. Japan remained firmly anchored as our ally in the Pacific. The cost was millions of Vietnamese, Laotian, and Cambodian lives, but the system achieved its primary objective. It preserved its dominance.
That is a very dark realization. The operation was a success, but the patient died.
When you're doing a systems analysis, you have to judge a system by what it consistently does, not by what its leaders say they want to do. And if a system consistently produces war, intervention, and the propping up of friendly dictators, all while claiming to promote peace and freedom,
You have to conclude that the war and the intervention are the features, not the bugs.
they are the predictable, rational outputs.
Okay, so before we close, let's just quickly recap the map of the system we've been talking about.
You have the planners in Washington, the backroom boys, you have the military, you have the corporations like Dow Chemical, and you have the universities providing the intellectual justification.
Then you have the media, which largely transmits the state's narrative. And on the other side, you have the public and the dissent movements acting as the constraint.
Things like credibility, not wanting to look weak,
geopolitical dominance,
economic stability for capital investment, and maintaining legitimacy in the eyes of the public.
the narratives, national security, stopping aggression, responsibility, modernization, and the feedback loops. Threat framing leads to public consent, which allows for intervention, which creates a backlash, which forces the state to engage in narrative repair, and the cycle repeats.
And the only variable that can really jam the gears of that machine is the domestic constraint, the awareness, the skepticism, and ultimately the resistance of its own population.
Which really brings us to the end of our deep dive. We've tried to unpack the chilling logic of the backroom boys, the sanitized language of destruction, the hidden economic imperatives of the domino theory, and the crucial role of the public as the final check on unchecked power.
And it leaves you with a pretty provocative thought. If this system is in fact optimized for dominance and control, and its only real constraint is domestic resistance, then what is the responsibility of the citizen?
When you hear phrases on the news today like surgical strikes or collateral damage or protecting our vital national interests, what are you really hearing? Are you getting information, or are you hearing the modern legitimacy language of the state at work?
The whole system we've described relies on you, the listener, internalizing its assumptions without question. The first and most powerful act of resistance is simply to perceive the system itself.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.